Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another video of History Valley Podcast. And today I'm joined by Professor Robyn Walsh. And today we're going to be talking about Q and the Big Bang Theory of Christian Origins. So welcome back to History Valley Podcast, Robyn.
Thanks for having me. It's always nice to be here.
Thank you for joining me. It's always good to have you here. So let's get started. Can you tell us a bit about the supposed Big Bang Theory of Christian origins?
Well, the title that you just gave is from a piece that I wrote. I was actually trying to
Hmm.
remember. It's a little bit old now. Let me take a
Yeah.
look.
And before we continue, this video is sponsored by Atlas VPN. Afraid of being tracked online? Afraid that your internet provider and others may see what you look up? Want to feel safe and secure again? Then look no further. Right now is the best time to get yourself Atlas VPN, for it is having a Black Friday price cut and is on sale for only $1.70, plus 6 extra months. And Atlas VPN will protect all of your devices at home with only one subscription. Furthermore, it also can provide you access to TV shows such as Friends on Netflix, not accessible in the United States. It also makes sure your searches on Google are private, and you can search the web with real and organic search results, and you can do it without your activity being tracked. It also prevents ads and malware, and it even blocks all malicious links and trackers and notifies you when someone is trying to steal your data. It also lets you save coins while shopping online, and you can get the best deals from online subscriptions including Netflix, Spotify, and even airlines, hotels, and more. Atlas VPN has benefited me greatly. In the past, some have tried to dox my location, but with Atlas VPN, it puts a stop to all of that. And I can even watch films and TV shows not accessible in the United States, including an uncensored version of Vikings that I can now watch thanks to Atlas VPN. So again, Atlas VPN is on sale right now for only $1.70 plus 6 extra months. And if you happen to be unsatisfied with your product, there is a 30-day money-back guarantee. You'll be provided a full refund. Use the promo link in the description below to sign up, or use your phone to scan the QR code on the screen now. But do so before the Black Friday deal concludes.
2017. So I guess not that bad. It felt like a long time ago because I can remember working on it and visiting family members in like my childhood bedroom. So maybe it feels older for that reason. But in it, it was actually at one point a chapter in the eventual book that I published. And I preserved the Big Bang part that you referenced of Christian origins in the book that I later published. But the idea there is this perception that tends to dominate scholarly discourse about early Christianity, which tends to imagine that institutionally, socially, not only did it come onto the scene in sort of this spontaneous fashion, but then it grew exponentially and rapidly in such a way that by the late first century, I think some people imagine, hundreds and hundreds of communities of Christians, or, a very, let's say, socially cohesive, but really sort of self-evident movement about which much can be said and much can be imagined. So you might even equate it to some extent to a concept of diversity in the ancient world, not the way that we typically use the term, but the idea that there are enough multitudes and enough variety because of this expansive growth that multiple claims can be made about different kinds of people and their interests within that Christian ambit. And I tried to challenge this on a number of levels. One is that, typically speaking, from what we know in allied fields, sociologically, this is not how groups tend to form, or at the very least, this is not how people, quote unquote, even convert, if we want to use that term. Usually, it's a much more complex process and long-term process for people to alter their social lives and the different spheres in which they function. And indeed, sometimes people might say, be curious about something like, let's call it the Jesus movement, but they still maintain their familial ties, or maybe they're in a social situation where they can't just electively, quote unquote, convert. For example, a woman within a household, would not necessarily be, if she's married, or under a paterfamilias of one kind or another, she might not have the liberty to just decide she's now a Christian, right? So these are just some of the nuances you can imagine that would pertain. So when we have something like Acts talking about the spontaneous conversion of hundreds of people, we have to hold that in tension with the sort of fantastic elements that tend to characterize new religious movements or new movements in general that look for a compelling narrative that is a foundational narrative for their founding and development. And so when I talked about the early Christian Big Bang, the Big Bang was very illustrative for the kind of explosive beginnings that I was thinking about. So I liked that visual. But I wanted to put it forward as, it's a theory, but one that I think was a little more grounded, or at the very least asking us to think more critically about what we mean by membership, growth, community, conversion, and the expansion of early Christianity.
And what are the problems in assessing this Big Bang of early Christianity, especially when it comes to the Q source?
So in that chapter, I do talk about Q. So the Big Bang piece survived, but the Q piece did not in the final book. One reason I wanted to talk about Q was, well, there were kind of like the secret reasons and then the reasons that made it into the chapter, and I'm happy to talk about both. But Q ended up becoming a really interesting example, I thought, in the way that it's been treated in scholarship of that kind of Big Bang theory of Christian origins, insofar as Q was posited as this bridge, as it were, between the writing of the Gospels and the early Jesus movement. And because it was reconstructed, because we don't have it, people could posit all kinds of theories about the nature of the document, where it came from, what it represented. And then in terms of the specific problem of using early Christian text to posit communities, there are different approaches to Q. Some people talk about the different schools of Q. There's kind of the Toronto school, for example, that's usually John Kloppenborg tends to be associated with that. For example, Bill Arnall, Sarah Rollins, people of that ilk. But there are other factions of Q scholarship, but in some of them, there's this tendency to imagine communities, not only a Q community, but multiple Q communities for even the smallest kind of thematic change in Q. So if you have some texts that are, or some passages from Q, this reconstructed document that talk about, say, eschatology, people might say, well, that's the eschatological layer of Q, and that is a Q community concerned with the end of the world. And then people would debate, well, is that a Q community concerned with the end of the world at the beginning of the Jesus movement? So people who think Jesus is about to come back, or is it a Q community leading up to the war because they see, conflict developing, and that, so you get the sense from that quick description that you had sort of this representation in Q of those instincts. And for me, it was interesting to look at it, not only because that sort of scholarship positing communities and thematic changes that symbolized communities seem to be something going on in gospel scholarship and positing communities behind the gospels, but you had that same characteristic of basically people would take literary tropes or literary features or thematic elements of a literary text and imagine people behind them. And I thought that with Q, it was so stark and a little bit more self-evidently problematic because Q is just a hypothesis. It's not something that we actually have. You could see how many machinations it takes, right, to get to this point of not only positing the text itself, but then layers to the text and then people behind the text. So that was essentially why I went with Q and what Q has to do with that Big Bang thesis.
When do you think that the Q document was written, assuming that you think it was one text and not several? If it is several, when did it start the process? And when did that process begin?
Well, one thing I say in the chapter is that I understand the Q thesis, and I don't actually have a very, very strong opinion either way about it. I understand why it has been posited. It makes sense to me. However, as somebody who also likes to think about the history of scholarship, I can also see why it starts really being discussed at a period of time where the idea of communities and layers to text and intertextual reading was also very, very popular within the field. So that didn't escape me. But one thing I say in the chapter is that if Q exists, whether it, had multiple versions, there was more than one quote unquote Q floating around, however we want to reconfigure this idea, there seemed to me to be enough in the composition of Q referring to dislocation, referring to war, referring to the temple, perhaps even being gone or the destruction of the temple, to the idea of, I use J.Z. Smith to talk about kind of this cosmic rupture that seems to have taken place as one of the main foci of the text, that seemed to be more characteristic of a post-war environment than a pre-war environment. As time has gone on, I even tend to think the Gospels are much later after the war than I used to. So if I had to put Q somewhere, I would say that's the one that's closer to the war, closer to 70 in my mind, than even the Gospels would be, again, should it exist. So right now, that's about where I would date it.
In that case, are you leaning towards perhaps an early second century dating for the four Gospels, like some other scholars are?
Not quite that late yet,
Okay.
but I'm also I tend to take a little bit of a bird's eye view of these things in terms of not finding precision at the level of dating to be as important. I think in part because I'm not trying to use these texts to necessarily reconstruct, say, a historical Jesus, or I see them within their literary environment and not as an environment to retrieve a community or group necessarily. So for that reason, I feel more comfortable saying these look like late first, maybe early second century in some cases, like maybe Luke text to me. What I am not too comfortable with is saying, for example, Mark 13, which seems to indicate warfare, fall of the temple, must be dated to the exact fall of the temple. That to me is a little bit too ambitious. It's something I teach still because it's the predominant view of the guild, and so I still subscribe to it in that respect. But I do, while not quite ready to say, well, then it must be second century, I am more comfortable dating them later.
Right, because simply because it talks about the destruction of the temple doesn't necessarily mean it was written right there and then. It just means it's not
Right.
earlier than that, perhaps.
And actually, to my mind, it would indicate later. Just, I always, in these kinds of environments, I wouldn't necessarily do this in print, but something I can say verbally is there, within a few years, people might be able to tell when something's written before the pandemic or after in literature. Not necessarily if something's trying to talk about contemporaneous time, but that can take some time. It doesn't necessarily, during the pandemic, people weren't necessarily writing about the pandemic, just to give one example.
Right.
Or yeah, something like 9/11. It might take a generation until you start having literature about that event. So the idea that somebody's, at the foot of the temple, like Mark, whoever he is at the foot of the temple writing this down. I think that for us is wishful thinking, because we are looking for more information about that time period, those people, and want a more concrete connection to the historical Jesus.
If we assume that the Q source did exist, and assume that the reconstruction about it, and say in the critical edition of Q is totally accurate, they hit the nail on the head, they hit the bullseye on the board, on the dartboard. Let's assume all that. What kind of document does Q look like to you? Is it very Jewish, very Hellenistic, a bit of both? Is it Platonic, Stoic? What do you think?
It does look like the kind of excerpting from, like, say, philosophical schools. I think about Pythagoreanism a little bit with this.
Hmm.
It does echo that to me a little bit. One thing I tried to do in the chapter, which I think people might notice, but then, it's like one of my little quirks, is throughout my discussion of Q, I keep saying Jesus and John, because John the
Hmm.
Baptist is also mentioned. And so I sort of posit there that it's not always entirely clear to me that this text couldn't have also been sort of a collection of sayings from both figures. So, even a retrospect on two holy figures from a period before the destruction in an era of dislocation again, just kind of to put something out there as an alternative theory of Q. It could also have included some sayings from other teachers. In that respect, I could go with the argument that this is a document that takes a collection of sayings from noted Jewish holy men of the first century, like Jesus and John the Baptist. Not necessarily to say that those are historical statements, but that could be the intention of the text.
So what can we know at all about the Big Bang that actually happened, the actual Big Bang for early Christianity? What do we know from the text that survive? What can we know
in general?
Yeah.
Well, I think certainly that for a variety of reasons, some I've posited here and elsewhere, that in a period particularly post-war, there was a great interest in figures like Jesus, like John the Baptist. And we know even, by the time Josephus is writing, he's also documenting other cases of, bless you, of Jewish holy men. And in the case of the Gospels, for instance, and even the way Paul treats the figure of Christ, you see an intersection between Jewish holy books and holy figures and what we might call Middle Platonism or Stoicism of the first century, which were quite popular philosophies and things people were interested in. So that combination of the Jewish holy books and Greco-Roman philosophy, I think, result in something that would have been palatable to non-Jews and also interesting to them. And so by the time you get to the Gospels, and let's just say that they're late first century, Paul shows us that there is already a representation of certain kinds of, he calls his opponents and super apostles, but other people who are part of this landscape of the ancient world of interpreting Jewish scripture, of claiming Jesus in particular as the predicted Jewish Messiah, and trying to basically appeal to different representatives and heads of households for sponsorship to talk about these things. Now, we know this is the kind of activity that was also taking place in wealthier households. And we know this from the late Republic, where people would be sponsored, quote unquote, within a household to say, like, a philosopher that, a rich guy could go to his house philosopher and ask a philosophical question. So that kind of echo of what's going on in the upper classes too, I think becomes part of the interest of what I've been talking about recently and what I'm trying to write about in my next book of what I call an aspirational class. So this is sort of like an upper middle class that, especially, in the first and second century, starts to get more economic capital, and they want to do the things that rich people do. But they can't quite afford, the kind of guy that a former rich dude like Cicero, right, like might be able to afford, but they could sponsor someone like Paul. So I think John Kloppenborg has actually done some really interesting work in his Christ Association books that show us, or his book, but his other work before that show us that the idea of a Christ group, relatively small ecclesia, that turns to Jesus, the Christ figure, as kind of the focus, you might call it supernatural, although it is part of the natural world, but a deity to become sort of the host deity of that club. I think that becomes more common by the end of the first century, gets established by the second. And then you start to have these texts, these biographies about Jesus in the Gospels develop. Paul's letters are floating around and people are evaluating them. They become the basis for the other, development of this other kind of literature and institutional structure in early Christianity. But I was fairly persuaded at an earlier time in my career, and I think it is still relatively the case, that there was this, Keith Hopkins wrote this piece called Christian Number and Its Implications, where he actually did try to extrapolate what would be the concrete numbers, given what survived in terms of letters, in terms of how we might imagine, social development over time. And the numbers are smaller than we might think if we're talking about, hundreds are not being converted wholesale every single day. So I would see more of a systematic process, a slower process that is tied to really concrete social practices, like the ones I just described, whether they are households looking to, engage in kind of intellectual practice and discussion of Jewish holy books and philosophy, or these ecclesia that were basically ancient social groups looking to sponsor a particular deity and have like a supper club. And I think those kinds of those facets, somewhere in between, you get the development of what we call early Christianity until it reaches the upper classes in the 2nd century, 3rd century, and beyond. Still muted.
Yeah, I just realized that.
Yeah.
What does Paul's letters tell us about early Christian writing, pre-temple writing, and does it help us at all better understand the Big Bang?
Well, I mean, I'm one who sees Paul struggling, maybe a little bit more than others do, in the sense that I don't think the groups he's writing to are particularly cohesive. I think that Paul's letters actually prove the Big Bang thesis is problematic, that these things don't happen as easily as, a foundational myth, or sort of our aspirational hopes for a more kind of streamlined, self-evident movement might be. Even when he's pretty much pleased with a group, he still has problems with them. So maybe you could say they are Christ curious, but they're not necessarily totally ready to buy everything Paul is saying. And Paul's clearly negotiating along the way, trying to figure out his own position because years are going by and Christ hasn't returned. I mean, in terms of what we might call theology, what seems pretty clear to me is there's more of an eschatological bent that Jesus is supposed to return any minute with his heavenly army. And so I think the more time goes on, the more Paul starts to come up with explanations like maybe we haven't found the right number of Gentiles, etc. At the same time, by the end of Paul's career, when he writes the letter to the Romans, which is his last letter, he hasn't quite made it to Rome yet. He's about to go there. There is a Christ group there. They're not his, but they exist. But it was also the case that Rome tended to filter in a lot of different traditions from the outskirts to the center. And so in that respect, it's not too surprising. So I think before the war, what you have and had already had before Jesus and before the Christ movement was an interest in Jewish holy books, interest in Judaism in general by the population at large under the empire, because this was a very ancient religion. And they did have these scriptures that people found compelling. And so I don't see that as unusual. And I think Paul shows us that it wasn't self-evident to everybody. And there was a lot to iron out before the war in particular, both in terms of how to become a practicing member of these particular ecclesia. What do you do? Do you follow the law? Do you not? Do you baptize, etc.? Do we circumcise? These are all the major issues. So that seems to be definitely on everybody's mind, and they're trying to work that out. But there's also kind of the general issue that there are multiple people with some kind of version of an understanding of these Jewish holy books also looking for some kind of sponsorship. So we have to imagine, I think, a much messier landscape, but again, not necessarily one that is very populous, in the sense that I don't think, the Germans tended to have this kind of itinerant prophet thesis, and Q sometimes got wrapped up with this, that there were all these itinerant disciples and apostles who were wandering everywhere, hundreds of them, and they would go to these groups and, survive by being taken in by these ecclesia and continuing to wander throughout the countryside in the ancient world. I think Bill Arnall has done a good job debunking some of that, that it actually kind of looks like the German missionaries of the Romantic period describing their own activity, not so much what we have in the ancient world. So before the war, I think you have people reflecting on Jewish scripture and on a messianic movement. Jesus becomes the center of that for some people. Other Jewish figures become the center for others. But it is not until after the war that you get a focus on what we would call the historical Jesus. Certainly Paul doesn't care about that.
And what does the Gospel of Mark tell us about Christians after the Jewish war? How has things changed by that point?
Well, to the extent that I don't think of a Markan community, as you know, necessarily. I think more formative for the author that we call Mark would have been other literature that he's reading. Presumably he is reading and reflecting on in the production of his text. But at that stage, I see a couple of things. One, who was Jesus? Because as far as we know, there's no extant evidence except for hypotheses about oral tradition to know precisely about his life, precisely what he taught, or his activities. We don't have really anything from Paul documenting much of this, even though he does know the immediate followers in Jerusalem, for example. Paul is not so concerned with Jesus's teachings or his life story or even his miracle working as he is about the idea of Jesus's return. So by the time you get to Mark, there's no pun intended, marked interest in understanding Jesus's narrative, even though it doesn't begin with birth, it begins at the baptism. His activity, his teaching, certainly. But one thing about Mark that I find interesting, and I think one reason they published the Q piece that I wrote in a book on the Gospel of Mark, is because I note that to some extent in Q, and definitely by the time you get to Mark, the kind of Judaism being portrayed in those texts, even through the figure of Jesus or John the Baptist, is not necessarily one that requires temple sacrifice. The temple is mentioned, but nobody is saying you must go to the temple to become part of this movement. That doesn't take place. And so I think in one framing is to say that what you get after the war in something like Mark is a version of this kind of Jewish teacher type, miracle working teacher type, but one that does not require the temple. And that seems to be an innovation to me.
And I'd like to go back a little bit, back to Paul. You were mentioning that Paul's letters, in your view, causes a problem for understanding and for postulating a Big Bang. So if we toss aside the Big Bang, what actually happened? What was the spark that caused the inception, in your view?
Well, I think Paul certainly shows that social processes are slower and more muddled and complicated than the Big Bang tends to allow. But I think without Paul's letters, whether he found more success during his lifetime than I tend to imagine, or because of the use of Paul's letters, because they were written down later on as the basis for something like the Gospels, I do think Paul's letters give us a sense of how that social development happened, which is slow, messy, fractured, then with times of coherence, and then with times of questioning and just a longer process of social development. So that by the time, you get to the fall of the temple too, and you have that additional historical dislocation, we don't know really what happens to the Jerusalem church after that. You have multiple social processes influencing both the interest, reception, and coherence of the early Jesus movement. So I think, Paul is very useful for showing us people who he, says like, you are the Corinthians. They're still having issues even after he leaves. They think, well, if I have a pneumatic body, I can do whatever I want. Or there are still social divisions between the wealthy and those who work with their hands during the day, where the wealthy are participating in the Eucharist meal and they're getting drunk and eating all the food. And by the time the rest of the so-called ecclesia arrives, there's nothing left. So you see all those kinds of very practical day-to-day on the ground issues in those letters, or the questions like in Galatians, should we be circumcising? Because this seems like we're joining a religious Jewish movement, even though we're Gentiles. So doesn't that mean we should circumcise to symbolize our quote unquote conversion? And Paul says no, right? So there's not agreement yet, because it's easy for us to say, because Paul makes it into the canon, he becomes the orthodox position. It's easy for us to say Paul had it right, but he clearly is in quote unquote competition with people who are saying this is a Jewish movement, including at various points, it seems James and Peter are saying this. But, if it is a Jewish movement and certain Gentiles want to join it, I can totally understand why the conversation is happening for several decades leading up, between Jesus's death and the Jewish war of, well, does that mean follow dietary laws? Does that mean circumcise? So that's still getting ironed out. So Paul's letters help us see the messiness. So again, Big Bang has this sense of like institutional structure, cohesion, boom. People convert, they have no problems. They have no questions, everything's hunky-dory. And at least Paul's letters show us it's much messier than that. And there are even some people out there who were probably, we see them allied to the Jesus movement, but they may not have even been saying anything about Jesus, or even if they were, about a Jesus movement that we would recognize as part of what we call now Christianity.
Some scholars think that, or at least are uncertain, if the Gospels, Gospels like Mark, or maybe even all of them, if they're familiar or unfamiliar with Paul's letters. Do you think that the Gospels are familiar with Paul's letters? And if so,
I do.
How much do you think they depend on those letters?
So one caveat I want to give to this is that I think we have a tendency in modernity to think that everybody in antiquity had access to all the things that we have access to. We do a pretty good job, I think, now, recognizing that we don't have everything they had access to. So we speak about our own lacunae, but we don't necessarily think about lacunae in antiquity. So when I say that a gospel author had Paul's letters, I'm not picturing that Mark, was able to sit down and like have Paul's letters, right? But he may have had some portion of them. He may have had one or two. For all I know, he had all of them. But the thing that I think, for example, Mark picks up from Paul is an understanding of how pneuma functions, spirit. Because as soon as you open up the Gospel of Mark, the pneuma comes down like a dove, and it's that action which gives God, turns Jesus into God's son. It's basically an adoption scene with the anointing. And, the holy pneuma becomes the mechanism by which Jesus becomes God's son, is then able to go out and perform all of his duties. And throughout, it's both the word power and spirit are used to describe how Jesus heals. But the terminology itself is straight out of how Paul talks about it, that he has pneumatic gifts, or he performs pneumatic demonstrations himself, that he has the power to do this from the Holy Spirit. I mean, the exact way Paul describes his authority is the kind of authority given to Jesus, both in terms of kind of that thematic element, but also the concrete ways with the terminology in Greek that it's described in the text. And so since Mark seems to be very aware of that aspect of Pauline philosophy, which is very Middle Platonic, very much within keeping of how Paul describes these things, that Matthew and Luke then use Mark, to me, shows that whether or not those two had Paul either, there seems to be a close reading. And I know there are some scholars out there who think Luke had First Corinthians, and they're able to demonstrate that.
I would like to now shift to Acts of the Apostles, because those that believe that Acts is providing a very reliable history of Paul's life and what Christianity looked like before the Jewish war, they might say that, look, we have a load of information in Acts. Look at what it tells us. Look at how much it tells us. What do you think about that?
Well, I do date Acts after Luke, and quite late in the 2nd century, I think is fair. I think I know there's some debate, is Acts actually written by Luke? But let's just say, for the sake of argument, it is. Or at the very least, it's somebody trying to do a faithful Lucan interpretation / impression, because that's how the text opens. We already know from Luke that he doesn't have firsthand knowledge of any of this. And I know some people say that Luke is a companion of Paul's, but I think that would become both internal to the text and external to the text more evident earlier on, if that were the case. I think if everybody knew that Luke was actually the companion of Paul, then it would have been used as an authorization strategy by others. So that I don't find particularly helpful for thinking that what's being portrayed in Acts of the Apostles is actually concretely historical. Then you have the problem of, if it is a second century text, the way that it's portraying this development of Christianity after Jesus's death and resurrection is very much a foundational kind of narrative that includes many of the sort of fantastic elements I think I've mentioned with you before, like a shipwreck, things like that you would expect from the Greek novel. So as an author, Luke, or the author of Acts of the Apostles, is chiefly aware of entertaining as well as informing about this kind of foundational myth for early Christianity, and establishing itself with a set of questions that I think are more characteristic of a second century context and the questions people are asking at that time than some kind of faithful historical representation of the past in the way that we would have those expectations for a historical description. It certainly, again, like, I don't want to take anything away from anyone who reads the text from a faith perspective, but certainly there are many miracles and fantastic elements in that story too, that I think are very characteristic of the kind of literature that was aimed more at fascination, entertainment, foundational storytelling, and even history telling, but kind of in that mythic tradition, than anything trying to record a history that you can use concretely to make claims about any of these figures or events. So personally, I don't use Acts of the Apostles except with, like, very, 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 very carefully to say anything about Paul. I tried to take what Paul says about himself in his biography as my starting point, and kind of weigh that against claims about him in Acts. But there are other interests and concerns going on, I think, in the second century that tend to form that text that I think we have to keep in tension.
And in my closing question, do you think that anything in Q at all can reliably be traced back to the historical Jesus, or is it so mythologized and Hellenized that it is not possible to tell?
Well, it's a really good question, because I never want to be like the downer who says we can't retrieve the historical Jesus, but I have to be consistent too, and I can't then say, like, well, the wisdom tradition must be the real Jesus material, because I'm also aware of the history of scholarly interpretation on this, which, the other thing about Q arising in the 17th, 18th, 19th century as a theory, was a time when people like Thomas Jefferson were making the Jefferson Bible, and they were taking out all the miracle stories and trying to retrieve, like, Jesus the moralist, right? So I always try to keep that historical context of theorization in mind at the same time. I do think that whether you date Q to before or after the war, and whether you think that it is the recordings of a reliable source for the sayings of Jesus, what seems to me to be characteristic fairly consistently across this kind of literature in the first century was a sense of dislocation, again, particularly after the war, victimization by the empire on the part of the Jewish people, and hope for some redemption from that by looking back at the Jewish holy books. To that extent, I think that those aims, and to the extent that the historical Jesus may have had or shared those similar interests, and again, John the Baptist seems to be featured here as well as another one of these Jewish figures, messianic figures seeking that kind of deliverance from oppression. Those things to me be consistent for a first century set of interests that morph and change over time, yes, take on some of those philosophical elements later on, but do reflect back on Jewish scripture as part of a larger conversation in the first century.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Professor Walsh.
Thanks, it was a pleasure.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell, and if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.